It's time for munching and mating in the Macrocystis, or giant kelp, with your host, Dr. Bill Bushing. One of the best things about my job is that when I go to the office, I don't have to wear a tie with my suit. Wetsuit, that is. In this episode, we will look further at giant kelp. Topics will include its growth, interesting reproductive strategy, ecological role as both habitat and food, and factors affecting the ecological disturbance of kelp and their persistence in the face of disturbance events. In the previous episode, we covered the classification, morphology, geographic distribution, and physical ecological factors affecting the distribution of giant kelp, Macrocystis porifera, and its relatives. It is an important foundation species, providing structural habitat for over 1,000 varieties of algae, invertebrates, fish, marine birds, and mammals. Ongoing scientific investigation into the molecular genetics of the genus Macrocystis and related kelp such as elk kelp, bull kelp, and others may yield important new information about their classification. Giant kelp consists of three primary structural components: the leaf-like blades, the stem-like stipe, and the root-like holdfast. The stipe, with its attached blades, is referred to as a frond. Photosynthesis occurs throughout the alga, although most occurs in the blades, which are morphologically adapted to capture sunlight and convert it into usable energy. Each blade has a float bulb or pneumaticist that is filled with a mixture of gases to keep the blade near the surface where sunlight is most intense. The holdfast serves to secure the kelp to the bottom and help it resist currents, swell, and storm waves. Giant kelp's distribution is affected by a wide range of physical limiting factors, including hard rocky substrate, sufficient water motion to bring in nutrients, areas protected from severe storms, swell, or surge, offshore slope, and depth, light intensity, light quality or the spectral distribution of light, temperature, nutrient levels, geology, and a host of biological factors that will be covered in this episode. Many sources have stated that giant kelp is the world's fastest growing plant. Of course, algae are no longer considered plants, but giant kelp is said to grow faster than tropical bamboo. However, some have suggested that the bull kelp, Nereocystis lutekiana, may actually grow faster. I'll leave this race to the experts. Under optimal conditions, giant kelp is said to grow at a rate of 2 feet per day, or an inch an hour, fast enough that you could actually watch it happen during a single dive. However, environmental conditions rarely are ideal, and more reasonable growth rates may be a foot or so a day. New fronds develop from the apex or top of the holdfast, and are therefore near the ocean floor where sunlight is reduced. Newly recruited kelp must be able to photosynthesize and grow under those conditions, so the new fronds can reach the surface and form canopy where light is most abundant. Although they are eukaryotic algae and not true plants, kelp use the same chemical process to trap solar energy and convert it into stored carbohydrates to fuel its development. The distribution of solar wavelengths, or light colors underwater, differs from that on land. Although chlorophyll A is kelp's principal photosynthetic pigment, they must also use auxiliary pigments like fucoxanthin to capture the most abundant wavelengths present. In this cross-section of a blade, you can see the pigment-rich areas on the outer edges where photosynthesis occurs. The equation for this critical chemical reaction involves combining 6 molecules of carbon dioxide with 6 molecules of water and transforming them using light energy into a molecule of glucose sugar and 6 molecules of oxygen. Because the canopy is where most of the energy is produced, these sugars must be transported from there to the stipes and holdfast in the lower, shaded regions. Kelps are believed to be the only group of algae which have developed special tissues to accomplish this. Although the stipes do not have true vascular transport tissues like many land plants, they do have specialized trumpet cells, as you can see in this cross-section of a stipe. Although light and nutrients are critical for this process, kelp has evolved mechanisms to deal with the fact that the highest levels of sunlight in the summer also coincide with periods of higher temperatures and therefore lower nutrients. Giant kelp has the ability to store up to a 2-month reserve of nitrogen to sustain growth during these times. The microscopic young sporophytes live at the ocean floor and grow towards the ocean surface where sunlight is highest. Growth is accomplished in regions known as apical meristems. The end blade on a frond is known as the scimitar blade because it is often shaped like a sickle. Here the blade splits into tiny new blades, which grow, create their own pneumatocysts, and increase in number as the apical meristem reaches towards the surface. There is a second region of growth found at the base of each blade, known as the intercalary meristem. The cells here divide in 3 directions, serving to give each blade additional length and thickness over time. As the blades and fronds age, their growth slows down. This allows a host of encrusting invertebrates to attach to the blade. This growth reduces sunlight reaching the pigment cells, further hastening the blade's death. Blades will then be subject to disease and other factors causing them to deteriorate and fall off as they senesce. The nematocyst will eventually decay as well, leaving only the stipes. These dying stipes may form seemingly deadly webs of kelp that threaten to trap both divers and invertebrates. Just kidding, right? Just as it is important that individual organisms grow and survive, it is critical that they reproduce and maintain the future survival of the population and the species as a whole. Although might one never guess it by looking at the large sporophytes in the kelp forests off our coast, giant kelp has a truly interesting sex life. The massive alga we see is just a small, large part of their reproductive cycle. The sporophyte generation is called that because they produce spores as their contribution to the reproductive cycle. This occurs in structures known as sporangia on specialized blades known as sporophylls clustered just above the holdfast. The sporangia are often grouped together in a whitish patch known as a sorus. Spores contain 1/2 the normal complement of chromosomes. Half of them are male and half are female. The large alga may continually release spores from spring to fall. Estimates of spore production by a single plant do not seem consistent. One source stated that at maturity, millions of spores are released, and the sporophylls decay. Others state as many as 500,000 spores are reduced per hour. Still another reported a single mature sporophyte may have many sporophylls, each containing billions of spores, and it wasn't Carl Sagan. The spores generally fall relatively close to the adult sporophyte. However, their small size and slow rate of sinking may allow them to be dispersed by currents. Large numbers are produced because relatively few survive. They may be consumed by filter feeders as they drift downward, or by grazers living on the ocean floor. The spores grow into male or female gametophytes, which represent the sexual generation in the kelp life cycle. These tiny microscopic plants become reproductively mature within 2 weeks. but may also remain in a vegetative state for up to a year if environmental conditions are not right. Female gametophytes produce eggs which release a chemical pheromone known as lamoxirine. The male gametophytes release motile sperm that follow this pheromone gradient to the egg. The sperm are so small that the male and female gametophytes must be within 1 millimeter or 1/25 of an inch of one another for successful fertilization. The fertilized egg then starts a new sporophyte generation. It grows on top of the female gametophyte. The sporophyte first becomes visible with a single heart-shaped blade. Within a few weeks, at a size of 3 to 4 inches, it splits into 2 blades. After 12 to 15 months, it is a mature giant sporophyte ready to start the cycle all over again. The sporophytes are perennial and may live 6 years or more. Individual fronds usually have a maximum lifespan of 6 months and are constantly being replaced by new ones growing up from the holdfast region. The older fronds break away in a process known as sloughing. A young kelp forest has individual sporophytes with only a single stipe growing very close together. Dense mature forests studied on the mainland usually have about 1 sporophyte every 2 square meters. However, studies at some locations on Catalina Island show densities about 10 times that. The gametophytes and very young sporophytes are tiny organisms living near the ocean floor, while the mature sporophytes have most of their biomass in the upper water column near the surface. Thus they must live and grow under markedly different environmental conditions. Kelp provides a structured, three-dimensional habitat for marine life that is differentiated among the canopy, vertical stipes, and holdfasts. The kelp blades and canopies serve as a substrate for a wide range of encrusting and free-moving species. These include the tiny snail-like Spirorbis tube worms that look like white spots on the kelp blades, bushy hydroid colonies, and flatter bryozoan colonies including Lichenoptera and Membraniptera may have millions of individuals feeding on drifting material using their unusual lophophores. And there are also predators on these encrusters, such as the well-camouflaged nudibranchs in the genus Corambi, establishing specialized food chains in the kelp canopy. The encrusting species have rapid life cycles, since they can only settle on the blade after its growth is slowed down, providing a stable substrate. They must complete their life cycle before the blade dies and breaks off. The kelp also acts as a sieve, or net capturing larvae drifting in the currents, which may grow into tiny sea anemones, juvenile starfish, and even fish larvae are caught. Seabirds may catch fish or invertebrates by standing on the canopy, while kelp bass and other fish may hide among the blades to launch their attacks on unsuspecting prey. Others feed directly on the kelp or on the invertebrates that encrust its blades. The holdfasts are said to provide secure homes for at least 175 different species. Of course, physical factors are not the only ones that may limit a species' presence, growth, or reproduction. Biological factors including competition from other algae for substrate or light, encrusting forms weighing down the kelp blades and reducing photosynthesis, grazing by invertebrates and fish, black rot, and other diseases also limit kelp. The invasion of our waters by non-native algae, like the recently introduced Asian kelp, Sargassum filocinum, can easily reduce substrate and light available to the microscopic and juvenile giant kelp stages. Of course, the kelp canopy also shades out smaller algae living beneath it, at least until storms remove some of it, allowing light to penetrate to the bottom. In addition to providing habitat, kelp is often a source of food for marine critters. Munching on another organism is often very limiting. Invertebrates that feed on giant kelp include several snails such as the kelp or Norris's top snail, which feeds primarily on brown algae. Arthropods such as isopods and amphipods, and echinoderms, especially sea urchins. Sea urchins normally feed on pieces of drift kelp, sloughed or torn off the sporophytes. When the kelp forest ecosystems are healthy, there is usually plenty of this food, and they do not generally harm the living kelp. The smaller white sea urchins feed on drift kelp falling to the bottom, but may also munch on the tiny juvenile sporophyte and gametophyte stages. Fish that graze on giant kelp include sea chubs like the opal eye and half moon. You can see their bite marks on these kelp blades. Marine critters that actually eat kelp can be a significant limiting factor. Although the alga's rapid growth usually offsets what is consumed under normal circumstances. Scientists believe some fish seen feeding on the kelp blades may actually be going after the invertebrates that grow or live on them. These include kelp bass, senorita, kelp surf perch, and rockfish. By feeding on invertebrates living on the kelp, these fish may benefit the alga. However, they can also damage the kelp in the process of procuring a meal from it. Even gray whales feed on the crustaceans that live among the kelp on their northward journey from the calving grounds in spring. Diseases like black rot may be associated with elevated temperatures and low nutrients. Given its importance as habitat and food for many critters, the presence or absence of kelp is an important factor in nearshore marine ecosystems. This may be affected by the physical limiting factors discussed in the first episode, or by the biological factors discussed in this episode. On a local scale, individual beds may be subjected to site-specific changes in limiting factors that affect them alone. Events which negatively affect populations on local, regional, or global scales are called disturbance events. A good example on land would be a forest fire or flood. Neither is present in the marine environment, but there are several types of disturbance that do affect kelp beds there. The ability of kelp forests to either recover from such events quickly or survive by resisting them is important to the persistence of the species. On a local scale, disturbance may be caused by changes in temperature, nutrients, or increases in herbivores. One all too common example in our ecologically perturbed marine environments is what is known as an urchin barren. In many areas of southern California, populations of sea urchin predators, including the sea otter, sheephead, and lobster, have been eliminated or greatly diminished. This allows urchin populations, primarily the purple urchin, to increase, overwhelming their normal supply of drift kelp. They may begin consuming live kelp, destroying the local beds. If certain organic pollutants like sewage are present, the urchins may survive on that and prevent new kelp from growing. Storms are also responsible for local and regional scale disturbance. Major storms may occur within the entire Southern California bight and cause large-scale removal of kelp beds. Fortunately, there are areas protected from such major storms, referred to as refugia, where kelp may survive and persist. Biologically, this is referred to as resistance. In the seriously affected areas, the removal of the kelp canopy increases light levels at the ocean floor, which triggers the growth of new gametophytes and sporophytes to allow the kelp population to recover. Rapid recovery from disturbance is another key to persistence. Global phenomena like El Niños may significantly increase water temperatures and therefore lower nutrient levels in our region and elsewhere. This often causes the kelp to disappear in the warmer surface waters. I've seen such warm water events affect temperatures down to as deep as 150 feet and kill even the holdfasts. Once the temperatures cool and nutrients return, the kelp will recover, but this may take as long as a year or two after major El Niños. The persistence of giant kelp in the face of such disturbance events is important to the marine organisms which live in the forests. Mapping and identifying these areas of kelp persistence may be critical for proper management. Such stable or rapidly recovering areas may serve as surrogates, helpful in identifying appropriate areas to establish new marine reserves. We will look at this in the next episode on giant kelp, as well as the many products made with kelp extracts and a number of scientific studies on giant kelp. Stay tuned and dive dry with Dr. Bill.